Today's subject is Prague Spring. And how many of you, before you came to this class, or this presentation, excuse me, had heard of Prague Spring before? A few. So, okay, good. We have a lot of new things to learn tonight. So, first of all, we have to go back and talk a little bit about the Cold War, since it seems to be something that's covered only briefly in school today. And the assumption that everybody knows about the Cold War, of course, isn't necessarily true. So, from 1946 on until about 1989, the European theater was, or Europe was divided between two worlds. The first world shown here in the blue and the second world shown in the red. The first world represented democratic republics for the most part, a few monarchical republics, and they were tied together by a military alliance known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the same organization that's fighting in Afghanistan now. The red that you see here was the Soviet Union and its allies, the Eastern Bloc, also called the Warsaw Pact. And Czechoslovakia is, I believe, is the, right here. It sits in a very important strategic position for the Warsaw Pact. It fronts West Germany, which is where the Russians always believed they were going to be attacked from during the Cold War. And so there was always a strong Warsaw Pact military presence in Czechoslovakia for that reason. By the way, as you know, the Czechoslovakia does not exist today as per se. It has since divided in two. During the Cold War, both sides taught their children that the other side was out to get them, that they were the true champions of people's rights and that the other side wasn't. And neither side really talked much to each other because they were quite content to go with stereotypes. 1968 then is the other context that we need to talk about. And again, as I told you, it was a year of things that were happening. It was, of course, for the United States, a year of shock, and because of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, just a few months apart. We had race riots in over 150 cities that summer. Our political upheavals with President Lyndon Johnson pulling out of the race for president that year, and the anti-war movement and violence at the Chicago Convention seemed to look like the United States was falling apart. And partly is the reason why the U.S. also was not really involved much in the Prague Spring, because we had our own set of problems that year. Remember also that we were involved hip deep in the Vietnam War, and almost everybody, much like the way the world has reacted to us in the Middle East, much of the world was unhappy with us with our involvement in the Vietnam War. And by early 1968, President Johnson had pretty much, after the Tet Offensive, had been told that we can't win the war. And so it's one of the reasons why he pulled out of the race that year. Not everybody agreed with him, but there was a consensus at Walter Cronkite, for instance, if you remember, in February, going on television and saying we can't win the war. Of course, student protests didn't just happen in 1968 in the United States, although they were all over the United States that year, major ones at Columbia University especially. But there were also student protests in just about every major Western country. Huge demonstrations in Germany, in France in May of that year, and I have a picture of that in just a second. They came close to overthrowing the government because workers sided with the students and set up the barricades in Paris. There were also protests in communist countries, as we're going to see in Czechoslovakia and Poland and in Yugoslavia, but also in Japan and Great Britain and Spain and Brazil and Italy and just about everybody but Canada. So go to Canada, okay. So all around the world, a lot of the kinds of reforms and the idea that somehow that they could remake the world and make it a better place were being challenged because of the student protests. They caused a reaction to it. Here in the United States, it would be the rise of the Republican majority coming back. And in other countries, it would be the crackdown on the liberalism, especially as we're going to see in Czechoslovakia. So, France in 1968, again, major protests. These were seen all over the world. Remember, this is a television age too, and so that things were seen, they were instantly seen everywhere, and had a tremendous impact on the expectations and the policies and of the student groups. We don't realize how important our civil rights movement had been. the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s had paved the way for confrontational politics that student groups in the United States followed, and then students all over the world followed. And so this was the background to what happened in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is a country that was created at the end of World War I from bits and pieces of other countries, of the empires that had fallen apart that year. Today, of course, it's divided into Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And there were ethnic differences. Slovaks were generally looked down in Czechoslovakia. They were mistreated in a sense that people thought they were stupid, and there were all kinds of jokes about Slovaks. And the peoples of the Slovakia is to the right in Czechoslovakia, and the Czech or the German areas were in the other area. So Czechoslovakia is unique, I'm sorry, I just missed that slide, in that it was the only country to ever vote in a communist government. Instead of having been taken over by the Soviets, they were liberated by the Soviets, and partly the United States also liberated part of Czechoslovakia under Patton at the end of World War II. But because of they had been so badly treated by the Germans during World War II, if you remember, the Munich conference in 1938 had basically to tear Czechoslovakia apart, and that Britain and France had stood by basically and had agreed to that appeasement. And the United States had actually congratulated Hitler on the agreements that he made with the Czechoslovakia in terms of taking over parts of the country, and then he later broke all the agreements and took over the whole country. So that at the end of the war, they were very happy to see Russian troops come in and throw out the Germans. And so they didn't have bad feelings about the Russians. And so in the post-war era, they voted in communist government, and most people were quite happy with that. They had been promised, for instance, when the Russians came in, that they weren't going to have any collectivization, taking over private property. But because of the Cold War confrontation, it happened within 3 years. And so they were told that it was a wartime necessity because of the threat by the United States. So it's a beautiful country today, the Czech Republic. This is Wenceslas Square, Good King Wenceslas, if you've heard that song. It's part of the cultural center of Europe. It's always been a city and an area of high culture. And it's actually the home of, if you like, any kind of American-style beer. It actually all comes from Czechoslovakia, so you didn't know that, but that's your 2-cent advertisement there. Now we come to the leader of the Czechoslovak Russian Communist Party, or excuse me, the Czechoslovak Communist Party. His name was Alexander Dubcek. Now, you never would have guessed that Alexander Dubcek would be any kind of a revolutionary hero. It just simply wasn't in his makeup. He was a typical party man. He had served quietly. He was a Slovak, and so that meant that nobody ever listened to anything he said. He'd suggest something, and all the party officials in Prague would ignore him. And so he worked his way up by being a good soldier, by always doing what they told him to do. And he was a lifelong dedicated communist. He never turned against communism or thought that it was evil his entire life. He died in the late 80s. And he was appointed to be the head of the party early in January 1968 for a variety of reasons. Now we have to go back and talk a little bit about communism here for just a second. Communism had spread across Eastern Europe during and after World War II under Stalin. Stalin had brought Russian arms, and in defeating Hitler and setting up governments that were communist in Eastern Europe, he had instituted a crackdown and it was a dictatorship in which people were basically mistreated. There were no rights. It was a military dictatorship, and there were all kinds of pogroms where they killed people. And it seemed to be that was the way it was because he had resisted Hitler. After he died in 1956, he was succeeded by Khrushchev, and Khrushchev shocked the entire communist world by standing up and saying, we've made all kinds of mistakes, and Stalin was an evil person, and we need to remove the stain of Stalinism so that communism can go forward. And a lot of people in countries that had felt that it was the only way it could be was this oppressive kind of communism where they felt liberated. And this is one of the reasons why that communism was popular in Western Europe, where they had democracies, as an alternative political party. And all of these countries, the countries of Western Europe, Italy, France, and Germany in a number of the areas, had communist political parties, and that cooperated and attempted to get people elected into office. And so they felt that they were, along with Khrushchev, were following along the right form of communism, the communism that should have been, that Stalin was only an aberration, of course, and that he's gone now and things are going to be better. And it's this expectation that's going to be shocked by the events of August 1968. So Dubcek came along, and Dubcek was appointed to be a leader, and the Russians did so by getting rid of a former Stalinist as the leader of Czechoslovakia, and they thought that this guy would be a good guy, would go along and do everything that he told him to do. And Khrushchev, in the meanwhile, had been replaced. And there will be some changes that took place. Now, Dubcek, because he was really not a great leader, he sort of didn't do anything after he took office. And in the short period that the first month, for instance, that he was the leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, he didn't give any directions. He didn't tell people what to do. And so in this vacuum, people began doing what they wanted to do, because they felt so good that the former Stalinist leader, Novotny, was gone. And so almost immediately, there was the beginning of what we call press freedom. Writers, journalists, and even filmmakers began exploring various kinds of things to go on. So really in a way, without him deciding to do it, it sort of came without him leading the pack. This new kind of reform communist movement developed under Dubcek throughout 1968. Certainly by April 1968, it's well underway. And as we see here, some of the key elements about this. One is there's a greater emphasis on individualism, on being able to do what individuals want to do, encouraging that. And instead of the communist model, which is each according to his need, it would be each according to his effort. In other words, you need to have a little incentive if you're going to make the system work. There was an end to censorship in media and literature and drama, and that itself was probably the most key event of the entire reform. Dubček's reforms, of course, like President Gorbachev in Russia later on, were ones that opened up the idea of freedom, but they thought that they could keep communist control in the process. Open up the economy a little bit, open up the political system, but that in the end, the communists would still be in control. And this is sort of today what China is doing. They have modernized their economy, but the Chinese Communist Party still runs everything. So is that communism if they have the capitalist form of free enterprise, but they have a communist government? Very strange. Who knows what we call that today? We'll wait for some future historian to tell us. What we see here are these are political cartoons and broadsides that came out very quickly. The first one actually came out in April, and it shows Dubcek there, and he's telling one pot to boil pot, and the other one he's saying is don't boil too fast. The one down below is I can't translate it, but they're raising the issue about all the murders that took place under Stalin and under Novotny, the previous Stalinist leader of Czechoslovakia. The fact that they're even talking about that made it revolutionary, because nobody in any communist country asked those kinds of questions or raised those kinds of issues. Because Dubcek seemed to be riding this wave of reform, and that people were becoming more and more energized in having new personal freedoms and so on, and feeling that like the heavy chains of the Stalinist era were finally gone, he became immensely popular. And it doesn't make any sense because he had no real personality. But people loved him anyway. And wherever he went, he basically, as I said, been a party hack his whole life, and suddenly he became the living symbol of the changes that are taking place, and got on the cover of Time magazine, as you see. Now, Leonid Brezhnev. He was the person who had replaced Khrushchev in 1964. Khrushchev, remember, had tried to reform communism, but that he had tried all kinds of ideas about trying to make it work. He had been dedicated to making the communist system equalize and then surpass the West. And we remember him taking his shoe off and banging it on the podium at the United Nations saying, "We will bury you." We also forget, though, that he tried to, along with de-Stalinization, push changes in the economy. He pushed the space program and certainly loved all aspects of that, because that all occurred under his rule. The Yuri Gagarin, the first man, the first woman into space, and so on, and the first orbits before we even sent one person up into space. And so he was kicked out in 1964 predominantly because he had not stood up well to the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So they got this communist bureaucrat named Leonid Brezhnev to come in and take over the party. And what they wanted was stability. They wanted the power centers in Russia and in communist Europe wanted to keep things the way they were. They didn't want to have this up and down kind of system that Khrushchev had done by challenging the old order under Stalin. And so Brezhnev was their guy. He was another party hack, and he got along. He was the one who put Dubcek in power because he felt that they had a lot in common. He called him Dasha, which was a very informal way of talking to him and so on, although Dubcek never felt close to him or anything. But he was the person who sort of set the whole thing up. Oh, by the way, he used to give himself all kinds of medals for all kinds of things that he never did in World War II. It was notorious throughout the Soviet history. Now, as the reforms progressed, the censorship and the talking of individual rights and the freedom of expression, the fact that in Prague now you could get Western jeans, you could dress up in jeans, you could read Western newspapers, you could read books that had been banned for decades. This worried the Soviets and their Eastern European allies tremendously because they had, again, regimes based on controlling information. We see a little bit of this today with China being worried about Google coming in and allowing too much information. Countries that have these command economies need to protect all sources of information. The biggest concern they had was because of its geographical position that Czechoslovakia might leave the Warsaw Pact and that they would be exposing themselves militarily. There was absolutely no question that that was going to happen. Remember, most Czechs were proud to be members of those that were members of the Communist Party, and they believed that communism had worked pretty well. This was like the frosting on the cake. They could have their economic security, and they were now getting all these freedoms without having to go over to the West. Many of Brezhnev's and his colleagues, especially the presidents of East Germany and Poland, who were particularly brutal, hated the whole idea of the end of censorship, because guess who were immediate targets of this? They were. And they were pointed out all the problems and things that they had done wrong, and they didn't want to be reminded of this. Especially, remember, this is a time of confrontation, and any kind of backing off would seem to be weak in the face of the United States and the West. So they saw the reforms, but they saw them as perhaps an attack on what they called socialism, which was their code word for communism. So on the night of August 20th and 21st, after several months of trying to get the Czech government to back down, the Czech government basically said, well, the people are doing what they want to do. We're still in control. There's nothing to worry about. The Warsaw Pact countries around Czechoslovakia had been doing maneuvers during the summer trying to warn the government that you'd better fall in line, and then they hadn't all gone home afterwards. And so on the night of August 20th, 21st, they invaded. As you see, 500,000 troops at least 500 tanks just in Prague alone. The Russians, of course, were told that they were going in because anti-Soviet elements or counter-revolutionaries had taken over in Prague and that they would be welcomed with open arms by the people. And the Russian plans were to come in 4 days, clean up the mess, and go back home. Of course, that's not what happened. In fact, they never left Czechoslovakia until 1989, when the Soviet Union finally fell. So plans have a way of changing. What you see at the top, the cartoon at the top shows it shows the five friends, it says, and it shows them all with daggers in their hands, about to stab poor little Czechoslovakia. Now this picture sort of says it all. The Czechs did not expect to be treated this way. And it's easy for us to say, well, it's middle of Europe, they should expect tanks. It would be exactly the same kind of reaction if tanks showed up in the middle of Paris and occupied it, or San Francisco, or even Porterville. How would you react? What would you think? And literally, this guy here, he is on his way to work, and the Russian tanks are rolling right through Wenceslas Square again. What are you supposed to do? Some of the reactions to the invasion are actually pretty interesting, if I can remember the translations of these here. Obviously, the colored one shows the relationship and the reaction to the Soviets in 1945 when they were seen as great liberators, and then in 1968 the child gets shot. The one on the bottom, it basically says, while the guys are waving to the sinking ship, it's called the Sinking Ship of Friendship. These were Czechs that were responding to this, that the Russian action is now, it's the end of friendship, don't expect anything from us anymore. The one in the center says, what kind of friends, basically, and it says, end the occupation, return sovereignty and neutrality. I mean, because of this, they are now getting what the Russians were afraid of, which is people saying we need to pull out of the Warsaw Pact. We need to stop being militarily aligned to the Soviet Union. The other cartoons up there, the one where the Russian soldier is fishing under the bridge, it says a convenience store for occupation troops is what it says below him, and above it it says go home in Russian. Underneath Leonid Brezhnev it says listen to Radio Vlatava, easy for me to say, because that was one of the pirate radio stations that immediately came into existence to oppose the occupation. It also says, a little bit further down, it says Brezhnev, it says study, 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 which is an old saying that Lenin used to say to school children, if you want to learn about communism, you need to study. So they're basically suggesting you don't know anything even about communism. Underneath that, it says 21/8/68, August 21st, 1968, he said the year of the gravediggers. Below that is a paper that they handed out to Russian troops that they printed up, and it says Pravda, or truth, in the top. And it says, on the article on the left, it says, you think you're here saving the country, all communists all over the world are condemning this. And that you don't even know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're here for. And the statement below the headline on the right says, why? Just why are you doing this? So these were the kinds of things that Czechs didn't just sit back and roll over, they responded. They printed up. They fought back in their own way. A lot of protests, a lot of resistance. Some of the resistance became very colorful. In one of the cases, people blew on August 26th, almost a week after the initial invasion, they all rang church bells, blew horns, and sounded sirens at one time, at 9 a.m., to protest the invasion. And some of the occupation troops actually got scared. So they shot a woman out of this, and they roughed up an engineer who was sounding his train whistle at the time. That was the first thing they did. They also blocked towns. They made human chains to keep the Russians from coming through the town. In one town, they kept a Russian truck convoy from coming through for 8.5 hours until they finally turned around. My favorite one is the one where there's a bunch of boys came up to some of the tanks and they brought nude pictures. And they handed them out to the Russian soldiers who were sitting there. They didn't have anything to do, so they started looking at the nude pictures. And their tank commander, who had been in a nearby restaurant, came by and saw them, and he ordered them into the tanks, and of course they took the pictures in with them. And then the boys stuffed all kinds of paper and stuff all over the periscope so they couldn't see out of the tanks. Then there was a lost train. There was a Russian train that was on its way with all kinds of supplies, and they just kept rerouting it. They kept sending it to all different parts of the country, and it never quite got to where it was going. In Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia, there they turned off the water. That was one of the things that a lot of them did. They didn't have any water, and then when the Russians went to look for drinking water, they said, well, you can't drink this water. Counter-revolutionaries have poisoned it. So they said the Russians started drinking out of sewers and out of water along the side of the road, and many of them got sick. Again, the water one was very good. So they also refused to provide food and supplies. That when the Russians had come in, the Warsaw Pact troops had come in, they were told that again people would welcome them, but instead people called them names and would not provide any goods for them. One part of eastern Czechoslovakia had people of Hungarian descent there, and so the Russian commanders thought, we'll just send the Hungarian troops there. And so when they got into town, people screamed and yelled at them and stuff like that. And in the end, they had to negotiate with the local mayor about where to stay, because nobody wanted to put him up anywhere. And so they put him in an old school, but he said, you got to follow the curfew. So every night, the troops would go in and the mayor would come and lock the doors of the school and lock them in, and then they would have to be in there all night until the mayor came and let them out in the morning. So this is a very strange occupation when you think about this. The people stood and resisted in many creative ways, which gives me pause to believe that human nature is incredibly creative. And of course graffiti, you think graffiti was invented in the United States, of course it was used all over. Anytime a tank stopped for a few seconds, somebody would come up and paint a swastika on it, just to let the Russians know what they thought, or they thought of who they were. You're not the liberators anymore, you're now the occupiers. There were slogans that appeared on the wall that said United States and Vietnam, Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. An elephant cannot swallow a hedgehog. And why bother occupy our state bank? You know there's nothing in it. So, oh, and another one there says, Leonid, send 10 more tanks, 20 more counter-revolutionaries have appeared. So, the Russians, basically made themselves targets for this. One of the things that it did was it pulled, it's ironic because Czechoslovakia would later fall apart, but it pulled a lot of the people together. These mass organized meetings and protests here, people simply filling up the square so the tanks can't move. We saw things like this in Tiananmen Square and so on later on, the democracy movement in China, but it was all pioneered here, with the people refusing to back down. The one on the right refers to a fairy tale about where everybody's trying to pull a turnip out of the ground, and so you get yourself and every member of your family until finally you've got 15 people pulling on it, and then a mouse comes up and pulls it and it finally comes out, adding to everybody else. So we all have to pull together. And so this shows all of the Slovak leaders pulling together to resist the Russians, get rid of this turnip and pull Czechoslovakia away from the Russians. Some people threw Molotov cocktails, which are sort of make-it-yourself bombs at the tanks. About 70 people were killed, mainly in Prague. They blocked roads, they jammed the streets full of cars. People were killed in that, of course. Very brave kinds of resistance, as you may have seen before. And here's some of the other people standing up. They engaged the soldiers in dialogue. What are you doing here? Why are you here? What are you doing? There's nobody here. There's no problem here. Why do you think you should be here? And again, your students throwing rocks at the tanks. Not a smart thing to do. There's one guy pulling what we saw in the Tiananmen Square incident, where the Chinese man stood in front of the Chinese tanks. Here's the guy doing the same thing in Wenceslas Square on the right. Would we have the courage to do something like that? That's the kind of thing you have to ask yourself. This woman is still around today, and that she said, that's exactly what she said, Ivan, go home. And of course the Russians didn't quite know what to make about all of this. They were sure that there were counter-revolutionaries out to overthrow the communist system. And instead, their very actions were creating people who wanted to get rid of them. Again, the tanks are pretty impressive. They went after and destroyed the radio stations. They went after all the official organs of communication, the newspapers, the radio stations, and so on. And then they simply went and created new forms of communication, informal ones. You're not going to hurt the tank too much with rocks, but you can get your feelings out. Again, here's some of the informal media. Immediate radio stations came up out of nowhere. Printing presses, they had mimeograph presses in those days. They didn't have the photo presses that we have today. And so some of the ones here, again, here's a handout on the right. The one on the picture in the upper left here, up here, shows Lenin telling a class, he said, Leonid, get in the corner. You're not being a good student. This one refers to the people who are cooperating with the Russian occupation. They said they're wearing cloaks of shame. Again, which refers to something that they had before in their literature. The other one, I can't remember what the other one says. I've forgotten. So here is, again, a copy of what kinds of things that they passed out. They told the army absolutely not to resist. They said, do not provoke, do not have any clashes, do not assemble in small groups. These foreign armies are provoking an atmosphere. They are occupying, stand with pride, stand behind the President Svoboda, stand behind First Secretary Dubcek, and so on. Our truth will prevail, long live the free and socialist Czechoslovak Republic. Again, protest rallies drew out hundreds of thousands of people. And this was all done without the United States or anybody being particularly aware beyond what they were seeing in the newsreels. President Svoboda was, even though he was a hardliner, he refused to knuckle to the Soviets, and so he became sort of a hero for a while. The one on the right says stand up to Moscow, President Svoboda, and the one on the left basically says, again, resist and don't give in. Thousands of Czechs, though, those that had gotten used to the idea of freedom, had to flee because once the crackdown came in and they began to put in collaborators into the government, they began to crack down on anybody who had participated in the Prague Spring, or anybody, especially if you're intellectual. So people fled to Austria. They have a long border with Austria, and would set up refugee camps there for them. From the United States, again, the Vietnam War was preventing us from being actively involved in this. And so we were pretty much watching on the sidelines. Afterwards, of course, there were a number of people killed, and there was no accounting for that later on. We see here at the Olympic Games, which took place in October in Mexico City. The woman on the left with the blonde hair is Vera Koslowska, and she was the top gymnast of that particular era. She won like 22 gold medals in the mid-60s. She was cheated out of 2 medals by Russians in that particular Olympics. Somebody, after she had apparently won on the floor exercises, they mysteriously raised the preliminary scores of the Russian person so they would have higher points than her. And then in the parallel beam, she'd apparently won that one too, and then so they inflated the score of the Russian to beat her. So during the medal ceremony, when they played the Russian national anthem, she looked away and down as a way to protest this particular event. She had actually been prevented by the new government of Czechoslovakia from going to the games, but had managed to get out of the country before they could enforce that, because she had been one of the followers of the movement. And then there's Jan Palek, literally burned himself alive in protest in early 1969. You see in the upper right here, you see the present-day memorial that they have for him in the middle of Wenceslas Square. And just a month later, they had another one, Jan Dubcek, who also burned himself up. And there was one other person that eventually did too. These again were nonviolent protests, giving everything to stand up for what they believe in. And again, they are considered great heroes today in the Czech Republic. The invasion basically settled what we now call the Brezhnev Doctrine, or what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. I keep remembering that the Soviet Union's gone, which was that the Warsaw Pact could intervene in anything that they wanted, in any situation they wanted to, but especially if they thought that it threatened Soviet control. So anybody who might want to liberalize, you could expect to be invaded. And it's ironic, of course, that the Russians did keep troops in the rest of Eastern Europe for the entire time they continued as the Soviet Union. And the Brezhnev, of course, went down as not one of their greatest leaders. The consequences, and this is where the whole issue becomes important. Czechoslovakia, of course, was kept under very tight control until 1989. But once the Soviet Union fell, they overthrew communism overnight. People celebrated, and then they finally got rid of the idea of having a unified country, and then divided into both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, both of which have joined NATO. They have the stifled reform movements in the communist world after 1968, until the Polish Solidarity movement came along in 1980, and then of course Gorbachev becoming president and head of party secretary in Russia in 1985, which is going to lead directly to the end of communism. Many of the Czech intellectuals and artists fled to the West because of that. We have one of the recent presidents, Havel, who was a playwright. Milos Forman, the movie director, came. He actually won an Academy Award, I believe, that year in 1969 as well, as a way to honor the Czech Spring. Communism was exposed yet one more time as oppressive. So it didn't matter that Stalin was gone. It didn't matter that they had crushed the Hungarians in 1956, but that had been at the end of the Stalinist era. There was not a new kind of communism. There was only one kind of communism that had to control everybody, that had to, even though it talked about the rights of people and the rights of workers and being free from the ups and downs of the capitalist world, in the end, it was all about force. And even those that were true believers, and this is not just people in Eastern Europe, but people in Western Europe, who had believed that communism would be the answer for all kinds of problems. And the political parties in the West that were communists were totally shocked by this. And they protested to Moscow. And in the end, none of their protests made any difference. Nobody listened to them. And so it was Stalinism without Stalin. And it was the beginning of the end. It didn't end it immediately. The end, as most things, take a while, and there's always a variety of factors, but we didn't end communism. They ended it themselves in their own countries. Although we like to think, it's sort of an American myth that we ended communism. That's kind of an American perspective that leaves off all the other things that happen. So, that's all I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
How long did that protest period last?
It was just, you mean in Prague?
Right.
It was just about, you mean the entire period where they were, before the Russians invaded?
Well, the time that you're talking about, the spring, and then...
Well, we call it Prague Spring, but it started in the first non-censored publications came out at the end of January 1968, and it lasted until, they continued for a few months after the Russian invasion in August. So it was pretty much the entire year of 1968, and it was pretty much shut down. Dubcek was kept in power. The Russians kind of tried to negotiate with him. They tried to get him to agree that he'd made all kinds of mistakes. They finally forced an agreement on the Czech governmental leaders, and in the end, they found that they didn't have any use for him, and they removed him in April of 1969. So it would have been throughout 1968 that there was this experiment, but it pretty much, the freedom to do what you wanted to ended on August 21st, when people woke up and saw the tanks. So they were brave to try to continue it, but in the end, you risked a career, or you risked basically being kicked out of the party, being kicked out of any kind of a job that you might have. So it was a better thing to do was either leave or learn to live with it. So, yes?
The United States was involved in the war in Vietnam, but Europe wasn't. Why didn't they stop?
Well, the only people who really spoke up against it were Charles de Gaulle, then the president of France. But of course, he was doing it so that people wouldn't remember the things that had happened back in May in his country, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain were the only two leaders that really spoke out against it. It was condemned in the United Nations, but the Russians simply vetoed the condemnation with their Security Council veto. The United States actually was kind of embarrassed by this in the sense that during the political season, the Johnson administration was busy telling everybody that before the Russians cracked down on this at the end of the year, oh, the Russians aren't going to do those things anymore. We get along really well with them. We have no problems with them, and so on and so on, almost at the same time that those things were going on. And Richard Nixon had recently, when he was running for president at this time, was telling people that we need to have a new view of the Soviet Union. And so he was embarrassed by some of the things that he had said and couldn't just sort of pounce on them and say, look what they're doing. We always knew all this time that they were crooks, or something like that. So I won't do my Nixon imitation. Other questions? Yes?
Just sort of from the far end of the downfall of Soviet rule in Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, you mentioned Havel, who became the first president after the communist rule in that country, who was a playwright, who was an artist, and from my perspective, it's interesting to note the significant role that artists and musicians played in sort of undermining one of Havel's first acts after becoming president is the first American who was invited in a diplomatic, quote-unquote diplomatic role was Frank Zappa.
Did he get a concert?
No, he was actually invited he was asked by Havel, who should I select for members of my cabinet? And so artists and playwrights and musicians were the people that Frank Zappa suggested, and they've erected a statue of Frank Zappa in town in the Czech Republic now. So this sort of dissident movement was largely driven by American rock and sort of underground rock, not only in Czechoslovakia but other areas of the Soviet Union. I find it a really fascinating thing that they used this as a way of protest, and it's directly connected to the people who came into power once the Soviet Empire was overthrown.
It's ironic, I think a recent PBS program, a couple months back, I should say a couple months back, talked about, and they interviewed people, including some of the deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union today, and said it was Beatles music.
Yeah.
I mean, they loved the Beatles. The Beatles, they tried to crack down on Western forms of music, but everybody, all the young people would go and would listen to, and they would make really bad copies. One person said they made a copy using an X-ray plate, on an X-ray plate. They would play that. You can imagine the quality's not CD quality, obviously. But people would break the law to listen to music. And that in the end, those things helped, we think about all the little things that helped to destroy the Soviet Union. The artists, musicians, listening to hard music, wanting to wear blue jeans, and then the workers in the shipyards in Gdansk in Poland wanting to stand up and simply having a labor union. All of those things in the end were much more important than anything the United States did.
Yeah.
So, good point. Thanks, Rob.
When the tanks went in, how long did they stay in that area?
Well, they stayed in Prague pretty much until a new government had been set up, which was by the end of the year. So they were there probably from August until about December. And then the Russian forces stayed in heavy numbers until 1989 in Czechoslovakia, just in case. Of course, they were also in Poland, and they were in East Germany, and in Bulgaria and Hungary. They were in all of the countries that faced the Western Alliance. So you always had that memory of, if you mess around, we still have the tanks are just right over there. Yeah, and you have to, the Russians wanted people to love them, so that was really an interesting combination. So, yes?
Were there any other weird forms, like you said about the school, about the
Being locked in the school?
Yeah, were there any other?
Well, I mean, other than the girly pictures, that's pretty weird, I think. But not any weirder than that one, though. That one's pretty good. I mean, the fact that they would actually listen to the town mayor and get locked away at night, that's pretty bizarre. But they did, the Czech people did lots of little things that probably will never, ever be recorded, in the sense that they resisted in any way that they could. And the Russians never had an easy time. And the guys who were Russian soldiers, they didn't know anything about what was going on. They were just told you're defending the Soviet Union. So they were just as patriotic as anybody else. They want to go in and do their thing, and then go in and find that the people, don't want them there. And that they're not crazy revolutionaries, they're just like people they know back home. So it's often something like that. Any other questions? Thank you for coming out on a Friday night. It's beautiful weather outside. Thank you on behalf of the Czech.